Hey everyone, welcome to the long-awaited Lucian guide. I know some of you guys have been waiting for it for a while. In case you're new around here, I'm Shock. I'm a multi-rank on Challenger mid lane and I play Pro Play from 2017 all the way through 2021. In today's video, we'll go over everything you need to play Lucian, and as always, every section is timestamped below, so make sure to check that out, and let's get into the video. First off, let's talk about Lucian's runes. I think there's only a couple rune pages on Lucian that are really that good, but I'll explain a lot of the minor runes as well, because they can change a bit. So the first keystone we'll talk about is PTA. I think this is the best overall. It's good at pretty much every stage of the game, and it's just really easy to proc on Lucian, as you'll see a bit later in the video. And also the precision tree is quite nice in general. So Presence of Mind, this one you could take something else. You could take Triumph and Overheal, but I think Presence of Mind is by far the best. This allows you to poke a lot more in lane, which especially if you're playing mid Lucian will matter a lot more. Also, like the other ones, Overheal doesn't really become relevant into the late game, although admittedly Triumph is pretty decent as well. I think Presence of Mind just gives you the best overall kind of like bang for your buck. Now the Legend tree, you can choose Legend Alacrity or Bloodline. Normally I go Bloodline, but if you're building a lifesteal item, for example, if you're building like Bork or you were building Shieldbow for some reason, you probably want to take Alacrity instead. But normally, because we won't be building that, as you'll see in the builds, I normally tend to just prefer Bloodline. For the bottom row here, you can actually take pretty much anything here. If I'm honest with you, these runes just don't have that big an impact. But I think the most consistent is probably Cut Down. Lucian doesn't build any extra HP, so it's pretty normal that people have more HP than you. This can give you a bit extra damage. I guess you could choose, you can choose the other ones if you want, but overall, I think it's kind of personal preference, and it doesn't have like too big a bearing on the game. So for your secondaries, I do normally recommend the Inspiration Tree, but what you take in it is pretty much up to you. So the strongest early game, and definitely what you should take if you're against a champion with heavy skill shots, is Biscuit's Time Warp, and you'll be running this with Corrupting Potion. So if you're against champions like Syndra, the extra movement speed and sustain will be really useful for you. You can definitely get greedier though. Probably the greediest page would be to take something like Cosmic Boots. This is definitely much more scaling, and there's a lot of lanes where you can do this, where you can still pressure a ton without needing that extra early game. Other than that, there aren't really other things you could take. You could choose Futures Market instead of either Cosmic or Magical Boots. But I think, yeah, it's like the kind of power spikes that you normally rush for, say, for example, Lost Chapter on a different champion, they're not quite as impactful on Lucian. So I'm not a huge fan of Futures Market, and I think you can normally get something from something else. So yeah, overall, I think you could do like Biscuits Time Warp, you could do like Biscuits Cosmic, Boots Cosmic. You can kind of mix and match, but the main reasons you take each one, Time Warp and Biscuits kind of go together. Biscuits do give you a bit more mana. Time Warp gives you like movement speed. You can also choose like Boots and Biscuits if you wanted. It just depends like really how greedy you want to be. Cosmic and Boots are quite nice scaling though. Are there other secondaries you could take? I mean, sort of. Like if you want to be super greedy, you could take a sorcery page with just a ton of AD. But I think this kind of just like leaves you without runes for like a good portion of the game. And Lucian's a champ that needs to scale quite early, or sorry, to snowball quite early, so I don't really recommend taking that. Again, it's sort of the same with runes like this, like if you want a Conditioning Overgrowth. It's just, Lucian is a champ that, I mean, he scales decently well, but his real strength comes from snowballing, so I think taking runes that kind of help you do that makes a lot more sense. So overall, Inspiration Secondary, normally the best. Down here, we always take attack speed. You can take Adaptive Force, but I think the attack speed's much nicer overall. Then you can take Adaptive Force, so AD in this case. You can take Health, Armor, or MR, depending. If you don't know what your verse or you just want extra scaling, you can just go with Health. Otherwise, if you're very certain, you can take one of the defensive runes. Now, talking about the second rune page that Lucian has is actually the Summon Aerie page. So this is if you're going some of the lethality builds, or if you just want a really strong early game. The runes are pretty self-explanatory. Summon Aerie allows you to just do a ton of extra poke in the early game, especially if you can't proc PTA, but you can just like harass with Q poke. There's also like Mana Flow, gives you extra mana. There's nothing else we can really take here. Absolute Focus is generally better than Transcendence. Again, if you're playing this page so you can absolutely dominate your early game, so Absolute Focus Scorch like really helps you do that. And then again, when it comes to secondary, you're probably looking to take things that just like really make your early game stronger. So I think if you were taking the Summon Aerie page, you'd probably take either Time Warp Biscuits or you'd take Cosmic Biscuits, depending on if you need the movement speed or not. But I think you definitely want the Biscuits for the extra mana. Again, in this same shards here. But yeah, so those are the two rune pages on Lucian. And it'll kind of depend what you're building. Like, it's normally the Eclipse builds that have Aerie, but even then, a lot of the Eclipse builds still have PTA. I do think PTA is a bit more consistent overall, and you should only really run Aerie if you're super sure that you can get a massive lead. But I'll kind of explain it a bit more in the builds, because there are a few builds you can do on Lucian, and I think making sure you pair them with the right rune does go a long way. Lucian's items are pretty in-depth, so I'm going to have to talk about this quite a bit, and also it changes somewhat frequently, but I'll try and kind of like keep all that in mind. So first off is the starting items. This does depend a little bit on what lane you're playing and also what matchup you're playing. So in my opinion, if you're playing mid Lucian, your most standard is Corrupting Potion, but if you're playing bot lane, the others may be more standard, but I'll talk for the reasoning on them basically. So Corrupting Potion is better for sustain overall. It's also better for mana if you're looking for more Q poke. And then Longsword, you can either buy Longsword refillable or Longsword 3 potions. This allows you to get a spike earlier, and we'll talk about that down here because there's some spikes like Dirk or Vamp Scepter that you can hit earlier with this. So this might be like you want to play somewhat greedier, punish your opponent a bit further in the lane, like after you get that one item spike, or even if you want, you really need that item spike in order to play the game. And again, that can be with either refillable or health potion. And lastly, you can go Doran's Blade. This does give you max HP and it gives you a lot of sustain. It's also much stronger just in straight up trades. So if you're just like having an all in, so much more common in bot lane, you might be looking at something like Doran's Blade instead of Corrupting Potion, but they're all quite good. Just to kind of give you, I guess, a standard, I would say mid lane, most of the time go Corrupting Pot, go Longsword refillable in greedy matchups, and go Doran's Blade if you really need the health, maybe versus an Assassin. And then if you're bot lane, I'd probably standardize Doran's Blade, and then maybe if you're a bit greedier, you can go Longsword refillable if you think you can get away with it. So early buys, if you don't have magic boots, you should probably grab boots somewhat early. It'll help you with your trading a lot, and if you're versus skill shot champion, it'll make quite a big difference. Cull is kind of like the Dark Seal of 80 champions. It's like if you don't have anything else to buy, it can be really good and obviously kind of turns into a lot of gold later on. That being said, it's like not the most efficient way to spend your gold because like a lot of the time Lucian can create leads if he has stronger items. So it's more like if you have nothing else really to buy, you can buy a Cull, but it's definitely not something you buy every game, sort of like Dark Seal is. Now, next, your early buys will depend on what kind of build you're going. So if you're like rushing a crit mythic, you'll probably be looking to pick up like the Noon Quiver or maybe like Pickaxe plus Longsword or like Pickaxe, Dagger or whatever. But basically like Noon Quiver we want, something you're kind of like looking to go towards. If you're playing either a Lethality build or a Collector build, oftentimes you can just pick up a Dirk. So for example, obviously if you're rushing Eclipse, like the builds out of Serrated Dirk, then that's really easy to buy. But also you see sometimes in builds that go Collector second, sometimes they will buy a Dirk on their first base, and that's because it's such a strong power spike, allows them to kind of accelerate, and even though it delays their first mythic item, it's almost like buying Zeal on Yasuo or Yon. It gives you like that strong power spike that you can often convert into more gold than like you could otherwise kind of convert at that time. Finally, Vamp Scepter. Again, if you're building like Eclipse or Bork as your first item, not super common, but if you're in a lane where you really need the sustain and you find like Corrupting Potion isn't enough, you could rush Vamp Scepter, but I think, yeah, I mean, it can be a good rush, but also it's like a lot of the time people will kind of do this when they shouldn't. You know, if you're buying a Vamp Scepter kind of to band-aid fix that you're not dodging enough skill shots or you're like not playing the lane correctly, then it can just kind of like put you behind to where, yeah, you don't die, but you can't really push your lead anymore. So it's not something I'd like highly recommend. I think normally you can get more out of other stuff, but there are some niche situations for it, and these all will become more clear when we talk about the standard builds kind of just below. So boot options, Lucian actually has quite a few. There's like a lot of viable boots on Lucian. So the first is Berserker Greaves. If you're playing an AD or like an auto attack heavy build, as opposed to kind of like a more spellcaster build, the attack speed boots are really, really good. And also if you're against like an enemy comp that's a bit shorter range, so it's easy to actually put auto attacks on them, it can be really, really good, but it's maybe not as good against some of the like longer range comps, or if it's very hard for you to like actually get auto attacks off. Next is Merc Treads. So this can be really good against like double AP mid jungles. That being said, you do have another good item against this, which is Hex Drinker and building into more later on. So this kind of depends. It's more like you can buy this, but it should only really be if you need the tenacity. So if they have some CC that you don't want to deal with on their team, Or if you really don't want to build into that more later on, it might be that the build you're going doesn't really facilitate that, and then you can build mercs. So it's a fine option. It's actually pretty decent on Lucian, but you don't want to normally just buy it for the MR because there's better ways to get MR. Next is play the steel cap. So this it's decent. The only other way you really have of getting armor on Lucian is with GA. And you can't really get that till like quite a lot later in the game. So if you really need armor, this can be a way to get it. It is a lot better against champions that are actually going to auto attack you, but I mean it's decent against some of the assassin champs. Although I kind of feel like if you do just need armor and you really need anything else from it, it can be better just to buy cloth armor. But that's kind of up to you. It's more like, yeah, I don't know. It's not super good in the early game, but it can be decent kind of as the game goes a bit later. Next, CDR boots. So this is really good if you're playing the spellcaster build. Honestly, it's like really good in general and probably the easiest one to play because I think berserkers are really, really good in the right situations, but they do kind of require some skill because you're going to have to be getting a lot of auto attacks off to make it worth it. But I think lucidity boots, they're cheaper. They give you some ability haste for your spell casting. They also give you some summoner spell cooldowns. So overall, I think lucidity boots are definitely easier. Sometimes berserkers will be a lot more valuable. But generally, you just kind of have to evaluate what you need based on the game. But all the boots are pretty decent, and I don't think there's really like a super wrong choice. There's just kind of like suboptimal choices. The next, we're going to talk about these together. We have the standard build and the meta build. And the reason I'm going to talk about these both is because the meta build that Lucian has right now is quite different from what it's been in the past. And also it changes somewhat frequently, so I will talk about that as well. But let's talk about the standard build, just like what Lucian normally builds. So normally we have a crit mythic. This can be either Gale Force or Kraken Slayer normally. Then we go the attack speed boots. We pick up Essence Reaver second, i.e. third, Serelda's fourth, and then we just, or I guess fifth. We just kind of round out with a situational item. Again, we'll come down and talk about situational items later, but it'll be something like, it could be GA, More, QSS, Bloodthirster. There's a lot of things. Generally, your last item slot is somewhat situational, and you normally can slot things in. Like after you get your IE, you can slot something in. If you need to swap these around, like if you really need armor pen, you can buy Serelda's before IE. So there's a lot of like min-maxing that you can do based on the game, but this is like your overall just standard Lucian build. Now, the meta build at the moment is actually a lot stronger, I would say, than the standard build, and it's really, really good at the moment, so something I'd recommend abusing. What people normally do is they buy a Dirk on their first base, and then they still build the Crit Mythic. Normally, this is done with Gale Force. The reason is because, again, if you're playing a more auto-attack focused build, well, you can still play an auto-attack focused build with Gale Force, but also Kraken Slayer tends to be, I don't know, they're just about even. Like Kraken Slayer and Gale Force are both quite good in that situation. But if you're playing a more like spellcaster build like this build here, you generally will want the Gale Force, and I don't think you really want Kraken Slayer in this situation. For the boots, again, you can go Berserkers, but I think in this build that the CDR boots are a lot better. And as your second item, you can build this Dirk into Collector. That gives you a lot of lethality. It gives you a really strong second item spike. And just like your whole early game here is going to be very, very smooth and very strong. There's never going to be a time where you're basing for something that's not super powerful. You're just going to be really strong all throughout the early game and all throughout the game as well. Third item, picking up Serelda's. It's quite good. It gives you a lot of armor pen. Also gives you the slow, which makes using your ult quite a bit better. Which is really important if you're building kind of a less auto attack focused build. Then after that, we have the IE, and lastly is situational items. So I believe this is better at the moment than the standard build. But the standard build isn't bad by any means, but I do think the meta build is a bit stronger and also a little bit easier to play. So definitely something you guys should think about trying. Now for alternate mythics, this build up here can actually be played with Eclipse instead. But I don't really see it that often. I feel like Eclipse was normally built when it was sort of like the Manamune build rather than the like crit build. And if you did this, it would be hard to pick up the IE because you'd need more crit. Like if we replace the Gale Force with the Eclipse, right? You don't get the crit to hit IE at this point. So you'd have to change up the build a little bit. And I don't really think this is necessary. Yeah, I kind of just like the build as it is, but it is an option, and it's possible a lethality build comes back, in which case it'll be something like Eclipse, Manamune, Serelda. That was common in the past, so not very good at the moment, but may come back. Next is Kraken. I wouldn't recommend playing Kraken with this meta build at the moment, but I think in this standard build up here, if you can get away with Kraken Slayer as opposed to Gale Force, if you're going to get a lot of auto attacks off, if they're a bit tankier, or if you just don't really feel threatened and you don't need the dash, both to like defensively and offensively, then Kraken Slayer does just provide like more damage overall, but it's a bit riskier. So definitely not something I would take unless you really know what you're doing and you really know it's the right situation for. Otherwise, Gale Force is probably just going to be like a better performer overall. Now, next is Shield Bow, and the reason I'm going to talk about this is because I think it's not super good. I think a lot of the times that people take Shield Bow, you can kind of just play better, I suppose. Like, people might take Shield Bow versus Assassins, but I think in those cases, you just kind of have to put them behind and take stuff like Exhaust. So Shield Bow is, I don't know, it's okay, but I think normally like the dash from Gale Force, you know, the extra power, like putting your opponents behind would generally be better. If you need lifesteal, you might want him to be going like the Bork build, which we'll talk about in a second, or the Eclipse build or something like that. But overall, I don't think Lucian's really a champ that needs Shield Bow. It's kind of like, the reason I think people might think he needs Shield Bow is because he is sort of short range, but I think you can normally get enough sustain with like your Legend Bloodline, with your Corrupting Potion, stuff like that. And you have enough tools to keep yourself safe if you play well. Like you've got dashes, you've got Gale Force, and you actually have a fair amount of range, especially if you're playing like a Spellcaster build. So I don't think you really need a Shield Bow, but if you really needed it, and I guess maybe if you were still like a bit uncomfortable on Lucian, might make playing a bit easier, but it does like hurt your damage output quite a bit, I would say. Now, situational items. So the first one I'll actually talk about is Bork. Bork is not a mythic, but you can rush it as your first item and then go a more standard build after that. But I don't really like it. I know, like, Nemesis, for example, has been doing a lot of Bork. I think it's decent, right? Like, it does give you a lot of early game strength. It's got a pretty decent... well, it's got some decent spikes. I wouldn't say a great build path overall, but, like, buying the Vamp Scepter on your first base, for example, feels really, really nice. But overall, I think it's kind of unnecessary and a bit outshone by other builds, but it's definitely something you could try. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's weak. I just think the other things are a little bit better, and you can still buy it later in the game. You can... actually, I forgot to put something on here. You can actually buy like Bloodthirster or Bork in the late game if you do need some lifesteal as kind of like your situational item, and it can also be a way to kind of deal with tanks quite well. So as for the reasons I just said, like Bloodthirster, it can be good like late game as a situational item, does give you a lot of lifesteal, but I think normally later in the game there are better items, so it's definitely not something I go for all the time, but it has its uses. GA, I think, is probably the most useful situational item. It pretty much always gets you at least some value. It gives you some armor. It also builds out of Stopwatch, which is really, really nice. So I like GA kind of as a situational last item, but you do have to be a bit careful because there are some comps whereas like if you die, you're just gonna die immediately after again. So you need to think about that. Sometimes there will be better items instead. Let's quickly talk about the fact that also buying Stopwatch and not even building it into GA is actually fine. Stopwatch is really good, helps you win a fight like pretty much straight up. So I really like Stopwatch. It's very cheap and you don't even need to build it into GA, although obviously you can. Now More is really good if you need a lot of MR. It's actually really kind of overtuned at the moment, I would say. Does feel quite strong. You can basically slot this into a build pretty much whenever you need it. The earliest I've seen it is probably like second item. It does obviously impact your damage output a fair amount, but it's like they're really heavy on AP threats. You can definitely buy it, and it will make you like really hard to deal with. So it's kind of like a trade-off. Like you are probably giving up some damage, but like if you can't play the game without it, then you sort of have to buy it. But also it is just like quite a good item. I actually think More is a little bit underrated at the moment. Definitely an item I'd like to see a little more. Now, Rapid Fire. I think Rapid Fire, I mean, I don't think it has a great place in the build normally. I feel like there are just other items to buy. But if you really needed that extra crit item, like when we're talking about with the Eclipse build, you could buy it. Also, again, you could buy it, I guess, as a last item if you need some extra range. But overall, I just feel like normally there are just better items kind of in the builds. And I think it's quite greedy, but it does give you more damage. So definitely something to think about, especially if you're playing that more auto attack based build. Now, Essence Reaver, I've just put it here situationally, mainly because like it just isn't used in the meta build at the moment. I think it's like a core staple in the standard build, but it can definitely be subbed out for other second items, other like crit items second. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like we've already talked about it enough. Obviously, it does give mana, and it is a sort of nice item. But I think there are definitely other things at the moment, and it doesn't get put in every build. So that's why I kind of put it in the situational items. Now, Mercsem, so this gives you a QSS. This is a really good item against certain comps. Like if, I don't know, I guess if you're just versus like a Malzahar or a Mordekaiser, this can be quite good. Otherwise, I don't really recommend buying it. I think You can kind of just get away with cleanse if you really needed it. Or alternatively, you can just like buy a defensive item or even just play better. So it's not something I would try pick up a lot, but there are a couple niche games where you can pick it up. That's going to be it for items. I'm just going to quickly talk about this like one more time. I think in general, the meta build is better at the moment. However, we might see a return to the standard build. So I guess like if you're watching this in the future, you might just want to check like what Lucians are playing these days. But either way, I don't think you'll be at a huge disadvantage. It'll just be like one is slightly better than the other. And finally, there are some other builds, but I don't really think they're that great. But again, Lucian is one of those champs where he can build a lot of stuff. And if you kind of like play Lucian well enough, it almost won't matter what you build. But yeah, overall, I think the meta build is the best. It's the easiest to use. It has the most power at the moment. So I highly recommend using that. Lucian summoners, we're always going to take Flash. And then I would say Ignite is pretty standard as second. This like gives you a lot of snowball potential, both in skirmishes and in the 1v1. So I think Ignite is pretty good to pick up, but there are some other options. So TP can be quite good if you're in a lane where you're going to get poked out a lot, or if you like really want to have a big focus on playing the side lane. That being said, it is really like it is somewhat hard to get use out of TP. Or maybe it's just like less consistent. Like you can get a lot of use out of TP, right? Like if you use your TP well, you can create a big lead with it. You can freeze your wave, stuff like that. But I think in solo queue, generally if you can get away with not taking TP, it's a bit better. Especially on like a more snowbally champ like Lucian that can like get involved in skirmishes and like last has some kills with Ignite. So I kind of think Ignite's a bit better. Other sums you can consider taking, Exhaust, quite good against assassins. Of pretty much any kind that can make it really difficult for them to play. If you're bot lane, you're probably just looking at heal, a bit more standard. You can take heal mid lane as well, but I think it's just pretty much always better to take something else. Finally, cleanse. This can get you a lot of value depending on what kind of champs you're against. If they have like one really key CC that can't really be dodged or is quite difficult to deal with, you could take cleanse, and that might allow you to play a lot more aggressively. But it's really important that you don't take this at the wrong time. So if you do play a game with cleanse, maybe think about how useful it actually was for you, because normally if you can take something else, it's really easy to just, like if you take something like Ignite or Exhaust, it's very easy to guarantee that this is going to have value, whereas you take something like Cleanse, it is kind of like a skill check. You do need to use it well. It does need to be the right game for it. And obviously you need to execute with it. So yeah, this is kind of up to you. I think Flash Ignite definitely the standard, but there are some other options as well. So now Lucian's abilities. First, we have the passive. After using an ability, Lucian's next attack will fire 2 shots, which deals reduced damage to champions, but it does deal full damage against minions. And also, when Lucian is empowered by another ally, his pistols become overcharged with energy, with his next 2 basic attacks to deal an additional damage, 30 damage. Basically what this means, after using abilities, you get a double shot, which will become important later, and also if you get buffed by like an enchanter, it's quite useful as well, and actually Lucian's like kind of a rare case of an early game AD carry that's quite good with enchanters as well. So now for the actual abilities, first the Q line skill shot does damage like this, and I'll quickly show the passive, which gives you a double shot after using an ability, and that's why it's super easy to proc PTA, because basically any combo you do, you're going to get quite a few auto attacks in. That's the Q. Next, W, kind of a line skill shot. Oh, I should quickly say with the Q, it's kind of like you have to aim it through your target. So it's actually kind of a weird skill shot. Like you can definitely hit people in a line like this. And yeah, the way to kind of use this in lane is to kind of line up a creep with them. So for example, if you imagine this front one is here's the creep, you kind of like line them up so that you can hit someone. And you can see that range. You can actually hit people from quite far away if you just queue through a creep. So again, if we think of that as a creep, you can hit from quite far away. So back to the W. It's like a, again, yeah, line AoE skill shot. At the end of its range, the first enemy it's dealt damage to. It also reveals them, which is pretty nice, and they get marked. And then whenever you attack that mark, you get some movement speed. So for example, as long as that person is marked, you can see down here, our movement speed is a bit higher. And that's pretty important because it's going to allow you to chase people down. And also it works with your R. So for example, if you can W someone before ulting them, it'll allow you to have like a lot of extra movement speed and stay on them, which can be quite important, especially when you're going for early game solo kills. Next is the E. It's just like a quick dash. It can be used to get over walls. Also, the shorter you do the dash, the quicker it executes. So one important thing about this is obviously that it gives you 2 auto attacks. So for example, if I E and then do a very short dash, it'll give you 2 more auto attacks after. So it's very easy to proc PTA with it, just with one ability. Also, its cooldown is reduced whenever you hit an enemy with Light Slinger, which is your passive. So basically, if I just reset this here, you'll see even if I start with my E, you can see you can get the cooldown quite a bit lower if you keep auto attacking. So that's pretty important. It means that you can get this like really low in the late game, and there are definitely combos you can do where you can dash multiple times. Finally, the R. So this is like it shoots bullets in a line. Basically, you can move and you can dash in it, which is pretty cool. It allows you to get a lot of solo kills. Also, just does an absurd amount of damage. The more points in it, the more damage it's going to do, and also reduces the cooldown. Also, interestingly, the number of shots increases equal to 25% of Lucian's crit. So if you build crit items, even the crit lethality items like Collector, it'll do really nicely for this. It also does extra damage to minions, so you can use it for resetting if you really need to. But I don't think that's super common. So yeah, some kind of important synergies that we have. We have like the W giving movement speed, which allows you to kind of like keep moving on them with R. This is quite important because otherwise, if you don't do this in the early game, it can be quite difficult to actually land your shots on someone. So I always recommend trying to hit them with W before ulting. You'll see something very common being like the EWR in the early game. Yeah, something like that. Some other things, just quickly, your Q cast time actually decreases with Lucian's level. So the higher level you get, the faster your Q will come, which will make it a lot smoother in the late game. So finally, for his abilities, let's talk about like which ones we want to max. Generally, you just max Q first, E second, W last, and put a point in ult whenever you can. Now in the laning phase, you pretty much always start with Q, although sometimes you can start with E, depending on if you like. You can start E if you really want to like trade auto attacks on someone, or if you're kind of scared that they're going to dash onto you. But what I normally like to do, and I think what most Lucians do, is they actually go 2 points Q. So they go like Q, E, Q at level 3, putting a second point in Q, and then finally putting a point in W at level 4. W is not super useful in the early game, although it can let you get all ins. You know, but I think Q is overall better for poking down. So it kind of depends what you need. But yeah, overall, Q max first, then E, then W, points in R whenever you can. And that should help you a lot. With everything you need to know for Lucian's ability. Lucian doesn't really have like too many combos, but we'll go over the basic ones and then maybe some tips and tricks. So the first thing is kind of how you're going to harass and lane. Most of the time you will just be looking to queue through a creep, so you'll be kind of like moving around this, imagining this first one as a creep, or even using the scuttle crab actually. And you'll be looking for kind of harass on your opponent like this, until you can kind of like punish them a bit harder. If you do want to punish them a bit harder, a great way to do it is by Eing into them, QAA, and then so that way you can proc the PTA and get additional damage on them. In general, it's really important that you weave auto attacks in between your abilities. So like I did there, you see E, auto attack, and then Q, auto attack. And so that's kind of like that's going to be like your level 2 and level 3 trades typically. Once you get W, obviously, you can kind of add it in at any point, but obviously, again, if you can weave some autos, it's quite useful. So, for example, if you could like do something like this, and kiting in the meantime, it can be good to make sure you get extra damage off. Just like, yeah, maximizing the amount of auto attacks you can get off. Another one that'll be really common is actually your all-in combo. So there's a couple ways to do this. You can either start with WE or EW. I think WE kind of like hides it a little bit, but like you're already dashing into them, so it's kind of obvious anyway. But either way, you'd be like EWing into them and then using the Q with the extra movement speed to kind of make sure you hit as many shots as possible. So if after level 6 they waste a key cooldown, or if they're like away from their creeps or something like that, oftentimes you can get an all-in with that, and that'll be very common. Other than that, there aren't really any kind of like particular combos on Lucian. I guess just like the other thing would be if very late in the game you have like a lot of items and a lot of CDRs. So if we take a typical build, something like where's the utility boots, grab this, and then like like collector, or actually if we go with more CDR just to make this a bit more obvious, let's just take something like this for example. You'll see that if you start with your dash, you can actually oftentimes dash like multiple times in a row just because the cooldown becomes so low. So that's why it's really important that you do weave auto attacks in between your abilities. Obviously, it gives you a lot of extra damage, and also it'll give you a lot of extra mobility. Some tips that could be useful for you, so you can use W to reveal enemies and areas. So it doesn't give you like vision of the entire area, but you can check if someone is in there. Another one can be that you can actually kite people away. Like you don't just have to go forward with your ult. You know, it's very easy to kite people back like this. It can be very hard for them to chase you. Another thing you can do is you can actually Gale Force towards your ult. It doesn't cancel it. You can E during your ult as well. Obviously, as we said before, there's like a lot of things you can do to make your combos a little bit cleaner and a little bit more creative, and just kind of create a bit more pressure that way. The last kind of tip I'll give for Lucian actually is just in the laning phase, when you are like looking to line up those Qs on them, it can be a lot easier to hit them if you wait for them to go for a creep. So for example, if they were coming up to CS one of my creeps here and I waited for them, then you can Q. That can be a bit easier. You know, it's really important that you hit Qs in the laning phase, obviously. The more of them you hit, the like stronger in lane you're going to be. So if you can make it a little easier on yourself to hit those Qs, it does go a long way. One last thing I'll quickly add on, in case it wasn't obvious to you guys, is it's really important that you dash while the auto attack projectiles are going out. If you do it too slow, for example, if you do it like this, you're not going to get the cooldown on your E from your first two autos. But if you do it quick enough, if you do like the auto like this, you'll see that it actually goes lower on cooldown initially. So that's really, really important that you do execute the combo as quick as you can, because it will shave an extra 2 seconds off your E, which is already, especially in the late game, a reasonably low cooldown. Okay, Lucian's laning phase. So this is something I've actually covered a lot on the channel already, quite in depth. So I'd actually recommend, there's like a couple videos I'm going to recommend to you. So first off, my fully explained Lucian guide where, well, it wasn't really a guide, where I just play Lucian and solo queue. I think I talked a lot about what goes on in the Lucian lane phase there. Also, Lucian is a very fundamental laner. So if you haven't checked out my full laning guide already, check out the range versus range matchup section, and also check out the cooldown punishment section. Both of those, I think I use Lucian as an example, so there's lots of other stuff you can have a look at there, and I think that'll go further than anything I'm probably going to tell you here. That being said, I'm still going to go over a couple lanes, so a range versus range matchup and a range versus melee matchup, and hopefully give you some sort of idea. But again, I really recommend checking out those other videos, because I've talked a lot about this already, and it'll probably be extra helpful for you. But I should explain a lot of the stuff here, so you probably don't need to worry. So in the early game as Lucian, you're mainly going to be looking to harass with Q through the creeps. You want to kind of push the wave somewhat slowly. You do want it eventually to come back to you, but you want to be able to like hit level 2 first and harass a lot with that. And you also want to look to punish cooldowns by dashing into them. So not every champion like Vlad will have the ability to trade back super hard. Obviously, some of them will. But in the early game, there aren't many champions that can actually contest you. So you can normally play pretty aggressively into them. You can see here, I'm playing very aggressively on the creep to make it more difficult for him. And also, I kind of like try and make sure that whenever he's able to move up, that I'm like either getting an auto on him. So like when he wanted to contest that creep there, or whenever he just like gets a bit too close. So if you hit level 2 first, you can look for this quick trade here. If I'd add a bit more distance, I would have been able to get the extra auto afterwards. But you can see, right, you can pressure quite a lot in the early game. On Lucian, it's up to you if you wanted like 2 or 3 wave crash. I think both are quite good. You can bring the wave back to you. It's not a huge difference. And again, it depends like how much you can harass them, and depending on the matchup, of course. And you can also, another thing you can do on Lucian is you can actually keep pushing. So again, it depends on the matchup. If they're a champion you can like considerably harass under tower, you can keep pushing. Otherwise, you might want to let the wave kind of like bounce back to you. You see here, the 2 points Q. He's too low to contest creeps. Like you can see this, right? He knows that if he walks up, it's going to be very difficult for him to get CS without taking a huge amount of damage for it. And this is ideal as Lucian. You can see him up 10 CS already. I'm just making it very, very difficult for him to get every creep. And this is generally how ranged versus range matchups are going to play out for you. The only champions that can somewhat contest Lucian in the early game are champs that are either just like very strong in lane in their own right. So stuff like Syndra or Victor. And also champs that have a way to kind of like punish you for dashing forward. So again, Syndra Victor being prime examples. Like if you dash into Syndra, you will often get stunned. So you kind of have to wait for her to use that. And also if you dash into Victor, well, he has his W. So this is one thing you're going to have to be very careful of in the early game as Lucian is actually getting ganked. When you do play Lucian, you have a massive target on your back. And so again, something I'd really recommend checking out is that fully explained Lucian video I did, because I kind of talked about there how you play when you have a farming jungle versus a ganking jungler. So yeah, I talked to you a lot about how these range versus range matchups play out pre-6, but I'll quickly go over post-6. So post-6, you're mainly going to be wanting to look for all-ins. You have extremely good extended all-in. So even if people are very high on HP, oftentimes you can look for all-ins. Obviously, it's a bit easier if you have Ignite, but it's really important that you recognize that kind of like Cassiopeia, all-ins on Lucian are more about space than they are HP. So on some champions, it'll be about like trying to get your opponent to say 50 HP, 50% HP before you all in them. Whereas on champions like Cassio or Lucian, you might be waiting for like a cooldown to be used, or you might be waiting for them to be like too pushed up in the lane or too far away from their creeps, that sort of thing. So just realizing that the way you punish cooldown, or sorry, the way you all in and recognize all in opportunities is a bit different from other champions. So you see again here, this guy walked a bit too far up in the lane. After he uses his pull, it's very easy for me to all in him. And that's like a thing about these like extended sustained damage champions, is that it's not often that you actually run out of damage. It's more that you run out of room to chase you down. So I think that's really important. Now we're going to go ahead and look at a melee or a Ranger's melee match. Ranger's melee matchups as Lucian depend a lot on what champion you're versing, but there are a few like common things, so I'll just talk those through. So first off, like generally melee champions have strong extended trades as well, so you don't have quite the advantage you have over some of these ranged champions. But the advantage you do have over them is normally they have difficulty kind of farming in the early game, and wave position is very, very important against them. So like a lot of them can't farm from range or have difficulties being like pushed up in the lane because they become very gankable. But it just depends a lot on what melee you're against. So if you're against a champion like Akali or Sylas that are very weak early, you can snowball against them really, really well. If you're against some of the more difficult melees, there's champions like Aurelia or Zed that have like really strong all-in and also kind of have the tools to survive. So like Aurelia has a lot of sustain. Zed has the ability to farm from range. So against like certain melees, it can be harder, but just generally, Lucian will beat them. But it's a lot closer. So here we're playing Lucian versus Aurelia. I'd say this is a matchup where Lucian is slightly favored, but it's very, very close. And if you don't play the lane well, it's really easy for either person to die. But again, in the early game, melees do kind of have difficulty trading back against you, which is how you can build quite a big lead. It's also really important against these champs that you bounce the wave back to you quite early. The reason is because if you're pushed up against, well, it depends again what champion versus, because if you're pushed up against a champion like Sylas, you can still harass them quite a bit under tower, although you will make yourself gankable and you make them safe from ganks. But especially if you're against a champion like Aurelia, if you're pushed up against them, once they get their like really strong extended all-in, they can easily kind of kill you after you kind of use your dash, and especially if you like misuse your dash, either if you dash aggressively and then you get punished for it, or if you kind of dash and get stunned or something like that. So yeah, just in general, the verse melee matchups, they're a bit more, it's harder to give like a general rule because like the melee matchups can differ a lot. But I think in general, the kind of core laning fundamentals of melee versus ranged, or of range versus melee rather, still apply. So you can see it's really important that the wave is kind of on my side to avoid stuff like this. So yeah, I think that's like super, super important. I also think a lot of these matchups are also very jungle dependent. So if you have a ganking champion, it can be a lot easier to kind of punish these champions. Also, it can depend on their champion, right? Like if they have a very strong, even if you're against like a kind of weaker early game champion, so let's say you're against something like Akali, if they have a very strong ganking champion like Xin Zhao or something, it can be a lot harder for you to play. But you can see in this sort of situation where the wave is right now, it's quite hard for Aurelia to do anything, and she has to use all her mana to kind of crash this, which puts me in a good situation after. So I'm not going to go too more into it than that. I think, again, the core things that you need to know for these matchups, the Rangers melees, is that wave position is really, really important. And also, again, it's harder to give like an overall thing because the matchups are quite different. But I would recommend if you play a matchup in solo queue and you're not sure how it goes, after the game, just look up, say, like Lucian versus Aurelia and kind of like see how it's played. These just do need a bit more experimentation, but again, if you want to know the fundamentals that will kind of like help you the most around these matchups, really recommend checking out my Lucian laning, or sorry, my overall laning guide, and just like watch the Rangers melee section and kind of understand like how that dynamic works, and then you should be able to apply that to like a large number of these matchups. Lucian team fighting is pretty fundamental, but it can depend a lot on what build you're playing. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. So if you're playing the kind of like more auto-based builds, the standard build that I talked about before, you're going to play more like a short range AD carry where like, yeah, if possible, you hit the kind of higher value targets, the enemy carries and stuff like that. But for the most part, you kind of have to hit whoever's in front of you, and you can kite back and forward in the team fights. On the other hand, if you play the meta build, which I think is better at the moment, you do need to think about trying to find like some creative angles. You don't have to look for huge flanks like a champion like Vladimir or LeBlanc might need to. But generally, your damage is a bit wasted on the tankier targets. So if you are playing the meta build, which again I think is the best, you're going to need to find like not just huge flanks, but, you know, just ways where you can really damage those carries on the enemy team. And it's pretty important that you kind of like assess the enemy targets and see which ones are actually important to kill. So this is with the standard build. It's from a while ago. It admittedly, we're quite ahead in this team fight, but I just want to show you guys kind of like what a standard auto-based Lucian team fight would look like. So here, I do try and look for the ult on this like important target with the Syndra. Then I'm forced to kind of kite back and just like put autos on the tank. And you can see like this is fine if you're playing the standard build because you can kill these tanky targets like Rel, Rel and Udyr like reasonably fast, right? But you wouldn't want to play the fight like this if you were playing a more lethality based build until I guess like you had enough items to where you just killed everyone. So the kind of standard things that apply in team fights still apply to Lucian. So we've got like you know, target assessment, you know, like playing with your team, trying to play with them, and also identifying what threats are important. So again, just very team fight fundamentals, but let's look at another example. When you're playing the meta Lucian build, fights that you might want to look for, or even if you're playing the standard Lucian build, just fights when you get really ahead. If you can find positions where you have immediate access to the enemy carries, you can kind of carry fights in a big way, because you can see here, it's really easy for me to just like turn the fight completely by just finding kind of a creative flank to begin with. So it's not like you have to look for this all the time as Lucian. It's not as important as champions like, say, Vlad and LeBlanc that literally can't really play the game without flanks. But if you do find the position to where you can get a big flank before the team fight, it will make a really big difference. And again, really important that you identify who those key threats are and kind of like position yourself in a way that you can get some damage on them. Some final thoughts on team fighting. I think Lucian team fighting in general is you have to be very, very careful with how you use your E and your R. So if you're not in range to auto attack, your E has a very long cooldown. Obviously, if you're in the middle of a team fight, you can get your E back quite quickly. But if you waste your E or you waste your R before a team fight starts and don't really get big value out of them, it can make playing the rest of the team fight very, very difficult, because without that R, sometimes you lack the range to reach people that are kind of key important targets. And also, without your E, oftentimes you can be engaged on very easily because you're very short range. Or alternatively, you might kind of like find it hard to reposition in fights. You know, you won't be able to get into over walls, you know, dodge key CCs, or even like close the gap to someone that's overextended. So I think Lucian teamfighting, obviously, it's going to be a lot about just like outputting damage like any other kind of like mage or AD carry in team fights. You know, getting as many auto attacks out as you can. But really, I think the important things are actually how you use your E and your R. And I think those will make a really big difference between just being like an average team fighting Lucian and a really good team fighting Lucian. So this is what I would consider for Lucian's kind of matchup tier list. I actually don't think there's any champion that I would consider to be very hard for Lucian. Just in general, Lucian is so strong in lane and has a lot of options with like sustain and defensive items that even the more difficult lanes, like they're not that difficult. I don't think there's anything I'd consider to just be completely unplayable. Talking about how the lanes go in general, if you're against kind of like the weaker early game champions or stuff like Corki, obviously, that can be very, very easy. It is worth noting that some of these champions down here, if you don't build a lead against, can be very, very difficult to deal with. So, for example, if you don't build a significant lead against Zilean, you could find the game quite hard to play because you are short range. You can CC you a lot in fights, stuff like that. Again, like there are champions that could be quite easy for you in the 1v1 like TF, but you have to be quite careful of their jungle pressure. And I'll also say that there are some matchups like TF where if you don't take cleanse, you can be punished in a big way. There are also assassin champions like Katarina where Lucian does win, but you are always kind of playing somewhat on a knife's edge. If you do make a big mistake and you give these assassin champions a lead, sometimes you can just see a matchup that would be considered free turn into a matchup that's like very, very difficult, because like if you fall behind as Lucian, everything one-shots you basically. So it's really, really important that you get ahead, stay ahead, and you do have the tools to do that, and you definitely have the itemization to back that up. But just keep in mind basically that if you don't play these matchups the way you're supposed to, then you're going to have very, very different results. The champions that tend to be the hardest, I think, are champions that either have significant range or ways to kind of stop you from going in. So, for example, Syndra, Lux, and Victor also like all have range, and then they also have like an ability. So, Lux Q, Syndra E, and Victor W, to where if you dash into them, they can kind of deal with you. Xerath E would be another example of that. But ultimately, you can definitely pressure these lanes quite a lot. It's just sort of hard for you to really take advantage of them. Some of the more difficult assassins to deal with, I'd say, are champions like Zed and Fizz. So Zed, One of the few AD matchups that can actually farm from range with his Q without kind of like compromising his whole combo. Now Fizz in the 1v1 is actually fine. It's more just like he has really, really good gank setup. And it can be quite hard to play against the jungler. So there's a lot of things you need to think about. I'm trying to think of these mostly from the 1v1, but some of the matchups are just so tied together with the jungler that they can be kind of difficult from that point of view. These champions up here, I actually think Cassio is not too bad. It's just very, very punishing. Like, more punishing than the others. You can beat a Cassio if you play it quite well. But it's definitely, like, if you make a mistake, you will die. It's kind of the same with Anivia. Like, Lucian just naturally wins basically every lane. But if you do make significant mistakes against these champions, they will punish you quite hard. Malphite, another one where you actually bully Malphite extremely hard in the 1v1. But the gank setup is so easy and so free, and team fights really well into you. So yeah, I guess these kind of like, one thing I should also explain is this like mid tier here, because there's a lot of champions in here which people are going to have very, very different results against. So champions like Akali and LeBlanc, like in the 1v1, you're very good against. Again, if you fall behind against, can be very, very hard, and you have to be very careful about the enemy jungler. There are other champions in here, like say Lissandra or Nico or Pantheon, where if you don't have cleanse, the lane can be very, very difficult to play. Again, other champions like Talon, if you don't have exhaust, can be difficult to play. And finally, there are some champs here where in team fights, they actually might do really well into you, even if you build a big lead against them. So for example, Veigar, I think is quite easy to lane against, quite easy to build a big lead against, but in team fights can be very, very difficult to deal with. So I guess that's kind of like my general opinion on the Lucian matchups. I think there are also a couple champions missing, which are Akshan and Vex. So Akshan is pretty fine for Lucian. I would say Lucian wins. The only thing you need to be really careful of is kind of the post level 6, I guess. Like sometimes he can all in you, but for the most part, I think Lucian wins the same. Vex, I think Vex is completely fine. Another champion that could be pretty difficult in team fights, but in the 1v1 is completely all good. So yeah, I guess like it's really important for you guys that you do look up these matchups after you play them solo queue, especially if you have a wildly different experience from me, because if you don't execute the matchups the way they're meant to be played, basically it can get very, very bad for Lucian, and it is a champion that is somewhat reliant on, not so much on being ahead, but just not being behind. I don't think you can ever afford to really be behind on Lucian. You don't really offer anything to the team, and there will be many champions that if you don't have threat on them, will just like kill you basically on repeat. So that's going to be it for this video, guys. Sorry for keeping you guys waiting so long. I was very busy recently. I'll quickly just say, if you have any questions about Lucian, make sure to drop them below or come to our Discord. That's in the description as well. Or feel free to just ask in the comments, message me directly. Basically, any way you ask, I will try and respond. Any questions about matchups or builds or anything like that, I will try and do that. I'll just quickly give you guys an update on what's been happening. So obviously I moved into my new apartment. I started streaming a lot recently on Twitch TV ShockLol, so definitely check that out. And also, I've been posting my coaching VODs on my second channel, which again, I think is pinned on my main channel page, but I'll drop it in the description below. So yeah, make sure to check that out, because I've been posting a lot of content essentially in other places, but maybe not on YouTube, so you guys might not have seen that. Anyway, guys, if you did like it, go ahead and like and subscribe. I really appreciate all the support, as always. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.